When Cancer learns to love themselves, the tides of the zodiac shift in reverence. The moon, their ancient ruler, gleams not with borrowed light, but with a power ignited from within. The Cancerian heart, so often bruised by giving too much, begins to remember its own sanctity. The armor of the crab, once worn as a shield against the world's harshness, becomes a sacred temple, no longer a prison of fear, but a sanctuary of reverence. In this rare and radiant awakening, Cancer reclaims the pearls buried beneath oceans of emotional labor. This is not a love that arrives with applause or validation from the outside. It is a quiet, thunderous revolution in the soul, a sacred remembrance of worth that needs no permission to exist. When Cancer sees themselves not as a broken vessel to be fixed by love, but as the ocean itself, capable of surging, soothing, raging, and restoring, something ancient within them stirs and roars. Astrologically, the moon's lessons are cyclical, ever-turning. For Cancer, loving oneself is a lunar rite of passage. The phases they endure, waxing with hope, waning in despair, are not punishments but initiations. Each heartbreak becomes a moonlit staircase towards self-recognition. Each disappointment in others reflects the parts of themselves they once refused to see. But when the reflection is no longer distorted by longing or the need to be needed, the true self gleams like moonlight on calm water, pure, whole, enough. Their empathy, once a double-edged sword, no longer cuts into their own spirit. Instead, it becomes a channel for wisdom. They begin to pour their care not just into others, but inward, transforming wounds into wells of sacred knowing. The tears that once fell in silence now become holy waters, anointing the path of emotional sovereignty. They realize they were never too sensitive. The world simply never knew how to cradle such depth. And so they cradle themselves, with the gentleness they always gave, with the love they thought they had to earn. This is the rebirth of the lunar warrior. Cancer, in self-love, becomes luminous. Their intuition sharpens, their instincts grow sovereign, and their energy becomes sacred territory. No longer do they chase the mirage of security in others. They become their own harbor, their own home. The divine feminine within them, regardless of gender, awakens in full bloom. No longer suppressed, no longer exhausted by caretaking without return, it begins to create, to nurture, to birth not just comfort but destiny. Their boundaries, once murky with guilt and fear, now stand like ancient stone altars, firm yet welcoming, compassionate yet unyielding. Love no longer comes at the cost of self-abandonment. They choose relationships not from hunger, but from overflow. They magnetize souls who mirror back their sacred worth. They no longer ask to be chosen. They are the choice not in arrogance, but in deep cosmic certainty. The Cancer soul in self-love becomes a guardian of emotional truth. They see the unseen, feel the unspoken, and stand unshaken in the face of emotional storms. Their silence no longer means suppression. It is the stillness of the moon before it rises, the power of presence rather than the noise of performance. And when they speak from oceans of inner knowing, touching hearts not with need but with resonance. They forgive themselves for every time they gave too much. They honor every moment they lost themselves in someone else's survival. And with that forgiveness, they rise not as someone new, but as someone remembered. They return to the sacred roots of their own being. And there, they plant the seeds of a love that will never leave them. A love that doesn't tremble in fear, that doesn't shrink in the presence of rejection, that doesn't compromise its soul for temporary comfort. A love that stands fierce, soft, sovereign, eternal. In this evolution, Cancer embodies the divine alchemy of water. The power to flow, to erode, to nourish, to heal, and to endure. They are the moon-born mystic who has walked through emotional fire and returned with light in their eyes. They do not need to be saved, for they have saved themselves. And now, they walk as both sanctuary and storm, heart wide open, no longer afraid of their own magnitude. For when Cancer learns to love themselves, the universe witnesses one of its greatest miracles. The moment when the nurturer becomes the nurtured, the protector becomes the protected, and the seeker of home becomes the home itself. From this place, they do not merely survive, They begin to create, not from wounds, but from wonder. And the world around them is changed forever. When Cancer learns to love themselves, a cosmic memory is reawakened, one that stretches beyond lifetimes. There is an ancient resonance in their soul, encoded in lunar rhythms and watery realms, that begins to pulse with clarity and strength. This inner unfolding does not happen in a single moment, but through the quiet accumulation of emotional truths, through cycles of pain that refine instead of destroy, and through a fierce softness that endures when all else breaks. This act of self-love is not merely personal, it is archetypal. It is a reclamation of lunar power that was once fragmented by doubt, distorted by external validation, and buried beneath the weight of unspoken sacrifices. Cancer was never meant to carry the world without receiving nurturing in return. But when they recognize that the first home must be built within, the architecture of their spirit shifts. They no longer view their sensitivity as a liability but as an ancient technology of divine perception, capable of navigating realms most cannot even sense. As the moon governs the subconscious and the tides, Cancer's journey of self-love activates the sacred waters of memory, intuition, and soul healing. This awakening triggers ancestral echoes, generational patterns of emotional suppression, martyrdom, and over-responsibility rise to the surface, not to haunt them, but to be transmuted. Cancer becomes the healer of their lineage, the lunar priestess or priest who blesses and releases what no longer belongs to them. Through the sacred act of honoring their own emotions without shame, they shift the trajectory of those who came before and those who will come after. In learning to love themselves, Cancer confronts the illusion that their worth is tied to their usefulness. The silent contracts they once made with pain, the invisible labor of always being the emotional anchor for others, dissolve under the radiance of self-recognition. They realize that their capacity to hold space for others does not mean they must abandon themselves in the process. What once felt like duty now transforms into conscious choice, and that choice is rooted in sovereignty, not survival. The energetic core of Cancer begins to align with divine reciprocity. They attract not those who consume their light, but those who reflect it. Their emotional frequency shifts, no longer vibrating with the desperation to be seen, but radiating the unshakable presence of someone who already sees themselves. This magnetic shift is not loud. It is subtle, powerful, undeniable. Others feel it before they understand it. It is the energy of a soul who has returned to their center. This journey is not without its sacred solitude. For Cancer to love themselves, they must often walk through a night of internal reckoning. The moon does not rush. It waxes and wanes. So too does Cancer move through cycles of shedding and becoming, of confronting shadows and birthing light. But unlike in the past, where emotional isolation felt like exile, this solitude becomes sanctuary. It becomes a space of communion with the divine within. It is in this quiet space that Cancer begins to channel dreams, visions, and truths that only they can carry. The lunar soul, once fragmented by rejection and betrayal, now begins to merge into wholeness. Cancer no longer seeks love from a place of emptiness, but from sacred fullness. They do not compromise their heart to be accepted, because they have already accepted themselves in their rawest, most unfiltered form. The wounds that once kept them small now serve as maps to their greatness. They have faced their own darkness and emerged crowned with emotional wisdom. Astrologically, this transformation marks a profound evolution of the Cancer archetype, from the emotional caretaker to the emotional alchemist. They become the vessel through which love flows freely, not just outward, but inward. They are no longer ruled by unconscious fear of abandonment or hypervigilance to protect others. They trust in their inner current. They trust the tides. They trust themselves. Their connection to the divine feminine deepens. This is not a passive femininity but a fierce, creative force that births universes from within. Cancer becomes a source of intuitive power, nurturing not out of compulsion, but from alignment. Their dreams become clearer, their voice more resonant, their presence more expansive. They do not need to fight to be understood, because they live in such deep authenticity that understanding becomes inevitable. Even the past no longer binds them. Nostalgia, once a prison of longing, becomes a reservoir of wisdom. The memories they once clung to are now honored without attachment. They do not drown in the sea of what was. They sail it, guiding others with their light. Their inner child is no longer hidden or wounded. It dances within them, held and healed by the adult self who finally knows how to love without condition. In loving themselves, Cancer becomes a living altar of devotion, not to anyone else, but to life itself. They become a sacred rhythm in the heartbeat of the cosmos, pulsing with compassion, courage, and clarity. They embody the paradox of water, gentle enough to soothe, strong enough to cut through stone. The same soul that once wept in silence now roars with purpose, carrying generations forward on the tide of emotional truth. The stars bear witness to this transformation. The moon does not need to shine with the sun's approval. It glows on its own terms, in its own phases, in its own power. And so does Cancer, no longer seeking permission to be whole, no longer shrinking to fit a space too small for their spirit. They rise not as someone different, but as someone finally revealed. Their love for themselves becomes a revolution. Their life, a legend written in moonlight and sealed in the sacred waters of the soul. When Cancer learns to love themselves, the universe itself bends gently to witness the sacred unfolding of a soul long tempered by the ache of devotion and the silence of unmet needs. Yet what has not been fully told is how this transformation alters the invisible fabric of their reality. This love is not only a personal act, it is a celestial force, an act of rebellion against every imprint of emotional conditioning that taught them to diminish their light for the sake of peace. There is an alchemy that begins in the unseen realms of the psyche when Cancer reclaims their right to be the center of their own care. The moon, ever shifting and dancing through the signs, begins to synchronize not just with their emotions, but with their higher will. Lunar cycles, once only tides of moods and memories, become portals of conscious creation. Cancer, through this inner awakening, becomes a co-creator with the cosmos. They cease to merely respond to life and begin to sculpt it, shaping it with the artistry of emotional wisdom forged in fire. In this new state, their intuition, already a gift, becomes a spiritual compass capable of guiding not only their journey but the healing of others. Yet now it functions from a place of clarity and detachment, not enmeshment. They are no longer ensnared by the emotional weather of others. Their empathy has boundaries. Their heart has discernment. They do not absorb the world like a sponge. They radiate into it like a moonbeam, graceful yet firm in its trajectory. There is a spiritual boldness that begins to rise in Cancer once self-love becomes their anchor. It is not boastful or loud, but it is unshakable. It is the quiet confidence of one who has walked through inner storms and chosen not to drown. This is where the true epic nature of their transformation reveals itself, not in how much they can endure, but in how deeply they can now thrive without apology. They begin to move through the world not seeking refuge but becoming it. This profound shift touches every aspect of their destiny. The natal chart of a Cancer individual glows differently when the fourth house of home and inner life is filled not with inherited wounds but with conscious love. They become the architect of their own sanctuary, no longer haunted by the ghosts of abandonment or betrayal. The karmic loops begin to dissolve. Patterns that once bound them to cycles of overgiving and under-receiving fall away like old skins, and they emerge luminous, stripped of illusion but adorned in truth. What remains unspoken but felt is how this act of self-love reverberates into the collective. Cancer, the cosmic mother, the lunar guardian, holds the blueprint of emotional security for the Zodiac. When they heal, the archetype heals. When they rise, the waters of the collective soul rise with them. They carry the medicine of the sacred feminine in a world that has long neglected it. Their love becomes not only self-restorative but world-restorative. Every act of choosing themselves sends shockwaves through generations of suppressed emotions, breaking ancestral chains with nothing more than presence, awareness, and choice. The internal child within Cancer, the one who once waited endlessly for someone to stay, someone to choose them, someone to witness their depth, is no longer left behind. This child is now held by a self who has learned to be both nurturer and protector. That reunion is holy. That union is divine. It is the reclaiming of lost time, of lost trust, and the beginning of a lifetime lived not from survival, but from sacred embodiment. Even their relationship with the external moon changes. They begin to mark their days not just with logic or routine but with rhythm. They honor their waxing and waning energies without shame. They do not force themselves into the mold of constancy, because they know the moon is never wrong in its fluctuation. They become a living embodiment of natural cycles. Their days follow the wisdom of tides. Their rest is sacred, their dreams prophetic. They tap into the power of lunar magic with a knowing that does not seek approval. They channel, they create, they conjure. In this place of inner mastery, Cancer is no longer defined by what they protect, but by what they allow to bloom. Their shell becomes not a hiding place, but a throne of discernment. They come out when they choose, not when they're begged or needed. They stop rescuing those who refuse to swim and instead become a lighthouse to those ready to find their own shore. And in all this, Cancer becomes free not from feeling but through it. Free not from vulnerability, but empowered by it. Their softness becomes a force of nature, unafraid of being misunderstood because they no longer need to explain themselves to be valid. They hold space for themselves first, and in that act, their cup overflows. This self-love is not an ending but a threshold. From here, Cancer begins a new mythos, one where they are not the martyr, not the abandoned, not the forgotten, but the remembered soul, the wise guardian, the lunar sovereign. Their emotional legacy shifts from sacrifice to sacredness, and every step they take henceforth becomes a hymn to the truth that they were never too much. They were always the ocean in a world terrified of drowning. And now, unafraid, they rise with the moon at their back, their heart a beacon, and their destiny rewritten in the language of light, depth, and the eternal sanctuary of self-love. When Cancer learns to love themselves, the cosmos acknowledges a shift not only in the individual soul but in the very balance of emotional power across the zodiac. What remains often untouched in these reflections is the profound effect this transformation has on time, perception, and the rhythm of fate. For Cancer, who carries the psychic memory of every emotional season, loving themselves is not just healing. It is time travel. It is a restoration of timelines where they were forgotten, unloved, unchosen, or made to feel that their depth was a burden. It is a quantum reclamation of every version of self that ever dissolved in the name of someone else's comfort. In astrology, Cancer governs memory, not the memory of facts or dates, but the memory stored in the emotional body, in the marrow of the soul. When they begin to choose themselves, that memory no longer acts as an invisible prison. The weight of ancestral sorrow and karmic grief begins to dissolve. The ghosts they carried in silence begin to release their hold. They are no longer haunted. They become the ancestor who breaks the spell. Their soul stops repeating and starts creating. This act of self-devotion opens portals to dormant potential. Cancer is the sign through which life is gestated, born, and protected. When that creative force is turned inward, the result is not just healing but rebirth. Their inner world, once shaped by others' needs and wounds, becomes fertile with dreams that had been placed on hold. Their creativity, once confined to emotional caretaking, now flows into expression, art, leadership, magic. They remember they are not just protectors, they are builders of reality. Loving themselves also sharpens their discernment in ways few expect. Once overwhelmed by emotional noise, they begin to sense the difference between resonance and responsibility. Their intuition becomes honed like a blade that cuts through false attachments and emotional illusions. They do not harden, they clarify. They do not close, they refine. They allow access to their world through the gates of alignment, not guilt. Their no becomes sacred. Their yes becomes a spell. And both are uttered without explanation, because their soul has become sovereign. They begin to stand not in front of others, shielding them from pain, but beside them, embodying what it looks like to walk through it. They do not need to be saviors anymore. Their example becomes the teaching. Their presence becomes medicine. Others feel safer not because Cancer absorbs their wounds, but because Cancer no longer abandons their own in the name of false peace. Astrologically, this self-love begins to activate deeper octaves of the Cancer archetype, connecting them with the higher vibrations of divine nurturance, psychic architecture, and emotional mastery. The connection between Cancer and the moon now expands into a communion with the divine lunar mysteries, cycles of manifestation, intuition as divine guidance, emotional states as cosmic languages. The lunar body within them becomes a sacred compass, calibrated not by external chaos but by internal truth. They become attuned to the subtle symphonies of the universe that can only be heard by those who have made peace with their inner silence. In this frequency, Cancer also begins to shed the karmic ties to roles they never chose, roles of martyr, of silent bearer of others' pain, of the one who always waits. They do not abandon love, they elevate it. They remember that love without self-respect is not love, but performance. And they refuse to perform, they choose to live instead, fully, deeply, radically present in every moment, no longer deluded by longing or eroded by emotional debt. This transformation also affects how Cancer engages with time. Their connection to the past, once a source of sorrow or obsession, becomes a sacred lineage they carry with reverence, not regret. They no longer try to rewrite old stories. They let them rest. Their future stops being a place of fear or fantasy. It becomes a canvas for the soul's purpose. The present moment becomes holy ground, where they anchor their light not in what was or what could be, but in what is. And perhaps most powerfully, when Cancer loves themselves, they no longer grieve what was never real. They see through the illusions they once clung to, the relationships that only mimic safety, the identities shaped by emotional labor, the love they tried to earn through self-erasure. All of it falls away, not in bitterness, but in freedom. They realize that the love they were searching for was never outside of them. It was always waiting within, beneath the layers of protection, performance, and pain. They rise as the sovereign of their emotional kingdom, not above others but beyond distortion, not hardened but holy, not invulnerable but infinitely resilient. Their softness remains, but it is fortified. Their care continues, but it is channeled. Their love flows, but it no longer leaks. They become the lunar soul fulfilled, the mother of their own destiny, the guardian of their inner child, and the artist of their own becoming. In the Zodiac wheel, Cancer holds the fourth house, the base, the roots, the home. When they love themselves, the entire foundation of the chart stabilizes. It is not a personal shift, it is a structural one. The soul, once fragmented by emotional chaos, finds its axis. And from there, everything begins to rise. Stronger, brighter, deeper, wiser. Because when Cancer loves themselves, the moon shines in all its faces. Not just the full, not just the new, but every curve in between. They are no longer a cycle trying to be whole. They are wholeness in motion. They are love in its most ancient, enduring, and elemental form. And nothing, absolutely nothing, can take that away. When Cancer learns to love themselves, there unfolds not only a sacred healing but an initiation into their own divine authority, one that has long been dormant beneath layers of ancestral burdens, unspoken promises, and invisible contracts of emotional self-sacrifice. What has not yet been fully explored is how this act of self-love reclaims not just their emotional body but their cosmic role as a guardian of emotional intelligence across lifetimes. There is a celestial calling embedded within the soul of Cancer, a purpose beyond personal healing, to hold the blueprint of emotional truth, to keep alive the sacred art of feeling in a world increasingly desensitized. Before self-love, the Cancer being often misplaces their throne, crowning others with the authority to validate, define, and direct their emotional experience. They seek shelter in others, unaware that they are the storm, the sea, and the sky. But once the veil lifts and they come home to themselves, there is no need for external coronation. They rise crowned by the moon itself, wrapped in lunar wisdom, ordained by tides that answer to no one. Loving themselves marks the end of emotional codependency and the beginning of emotional mastery. This is not a rejection of connection, but the refinement of it. Cancer begins to choose only those relationships that honor mutual growth, those that water their garden without draining the roots. They no longer confuse attachment with love, sacrifice with worth, or pain with passion. They hold space not from obligation, but from overflow. Their energy becomes sacred ground. Not everyone may enter. Only those who match the frequency of their healing are invited into their sacred circle. As this inner alchemy progresses, their relationship with destiny itself transforms. In traditional astrology, Cancer is not only the sign of the moon and the fourth house. It is also a gatekeeper to legacy, to origin, to spiritual DNA. When Cancer loves themselves, they do not only rewrite their story, they reweave the threads of their entire bloodline. They stop carrying shame that is not theirs. They release grief passed down through generations. They cleanse the maternal and paternal lines not by force, but by choosing not to repeat what broke them. The love they give themselves becomes a healing balm sent backward through time and forward through all who will come after. This act also initiates the emergence of Cancer's higher gifts: intuitive vision, emotional transmutation, and energetic protection. Their dreams become clearer. Their ability to sense truth through feeling becomes undeniable. They no longer doubt the messages of their body, the sacred pulses in their heart, or the knowing that rises through silence. Their home is no longer a physical structure. It becomes their body, their aura, their inner temple. They protect it with reverence. They adorn it with care. They fill it with rituals that align their energy to the divine flow of the cosmos. In the Zodiac, each sign holds a key to human evolution. Cancer holds the key to emotional maturity, which begins with self-compassion. When they embody this, they model what it looks like to evolve not by denying emotion, but by embracing it. They do not seek to escape pain, they alchemize it into wisdom. They do not abandon joy, they learn to hold it without guilt. And they teach others, simply through presence, how to do the same. They become living proof that sensitivity is not fragility. It is strength refined through self-awareness. Their journey into self-love also awakens the connection between Cancer and the sacred feminine mysteries, regardless of gender. They embody the Great Mother archetype, not as one who is depleted and forgotten, but as one who stands fully resourced, fully aware, and fully sovereign. They become midwives of emotional rebirth, not just for themselves, but for the collective. Their emotional field becomes a womb where transformation can take place, not through drama, but through depth, not through force, but through feeling. When Cancer stands in self-love, their very presence begins to disrupt cycles of emotional suppression around them. They challenge narratives that praise stoicism and dismiss vulnerability. They become vessels through which suppressed emotions, both personal and collective, are named, felt, and released. They help others return to the inner child not as a place of wounding, but as a source of creativity and joy. They restore the value of the sacred pause, the quiet moment, the tear that falls in truth. In doing so, they become stewards of the emotional evolution of humanity. From an epic view of soul purpose, Cancer is the keeper of soul memory. When they reject themselves, the memory distorts. But when they love themselves, the memory corrects. They begin to remember why they came. They recall soul contracts, sacred promises, ancient dreams. They reconnect to their lunar purpose, not to be consumed by feeling, but to channel it into purpose. Their life becomes a bridge between emotional authenticity and divine manifestation. And finally, when Cancer loves themselves, they reclaim time as a spiral, not a line. They begin to move not in urgency but in alignment. Their decisions are no longer reactions to fear, but responses to inner truth. They do not rush, because the moon does not rush. They do not chase, because water does not need to pursue. It flows, it carves, it receives. Their life becomes a dance with the divine rhythms of nature, a sacred flow of giving and receiving, of nourishing and being nourished. They become not just the sign of home, but the embodiment of home. And from that place, everything changes, not just for them, but for the world around them. Because when a Cancerian heart loves itself, it becomes a source of healing so profound. It echoes through the oceans of existence, restoring the lost, soothing the restless, and reminding all beings that there is no power greater than a soul that dares to feel, to rise, and to love itself into wholeness. When Cancer learns to love themselves, something extraordinary awakens not only in their soul, but in the architecture of the emotional universe. A subtle but irreversible shift occurs in the elemental harmony of water, as if the seas themselves begin to sing a different song, one that echoes the frequencies of sovereignty, spiritual rebirth, and sacred alignment. There is a dimension of this transformation that exists beyond emotional healing or personal growth, a cosmic restoration of emotional nobility, where Cancer reclaims their place as one of the divine custodians of feeling, memory, intuition, and nourishment across realms. So often overlooked is the truth that Cancer's emotional depth is not a passive state of receptivity, but a profound power source. It is a current strong enough to reshape worlds, to transmute pain into purpose, to hold the unbearable weight of others' stories without collapsing. But until they love themselves, that power remains dormant, tangled in patterns of giving that lack reciprocity. Once self-love enters, the flow is reversed. They are no longer vessels for others to pour into or drain from. They become the wellspring. They become the origin. The water does not flood outward anymore. It rises upward, becoming sacred mist, nourishing the air with clarity and calm. This transformation activates Cancer's full elemental potential. Water, in its highest expression, does not only soothe, it reveals. It reflects truth. It awakens memory. It dissolves illusion. The Cancerian soul, bathed in self-love, becomes an oracle of emotional truth that pierces through pretension and connects directly with the essence of others. They begin to see not just the pain others carry, but the purpose beneath it. And because they have finally held their own suffering with compassion rather than shame, they can hold the pain of the world without being undone by it. Their energy is no longer porous and unprotected. It is potent and conscious. Their empathy becomes a force field, not a wound. This awakening also initiates a resurrection of voice. So much of Cancer's emotional history has been lived in silence, in tears not seen, in words swallowed to keep the peace. When they love themselves, the voice that once trembled begins to thunder. It is not loud with aggression, but with authority born of emotional truth. They begin to speak, not from the throat alone, but from the heart. Their words begin to carry the weight of ancestral healing, the resonance of lunar wisdom, and the vibrational codes of emotional transformation. They do not argue to be understood, they declare truth to be felt. Within the greater astrological tapestry, Cancer's position as a cardinal sign is deeply significant. Cardinal signs initiate seasons. They are beginnings, directional forces, energies that create movement and shape destiny. Cancer, as the cardinal water sign, initiates the season of soul. When this energy is expressed through self-abandonment, it initiates cycles of emotional dependency and overextension. But when rooted in self-love, Cancer becomes the sacred initiator of deep emotional presence in a world starving for it. They begin movements not with slogans, but with sincerity. They start revolutions not with fire, but with feeling. Their presence becomes a climate, and in it, others begin to remember how to feel again. Their relationship with lunar time becomes central to this mastery. Where others are imprisoned by linear clocks and artificial calendars, Cancer begins to move in lunar rhythm, governed by intuitive knowing rather than external expectation. They no longer judge their days by productivity, but by alignment. They rise when their energy rises. They rest without guilt. They create when the moonlight moves through them, and they withdraw when darkness calls them inward. In this sacred ebb and flow, they access dimensions of manifestation that logic alone could never touch. Their intuition becomes their compass, and miracles unfold not through effort, but through resonance. Another aspect that takes root is their embodiment of sacred parenting energy, not in the literal sense, but in how they nurture not only their inner child, but the inner children of humanity. They become walking sanctuaries. People feel safer in their presence, not because Cancer seeks to fix them, but because they are anchored in their own healed heart. They no longer feel responsible for rescuing others. Instead, they mirror wholeness so powerfully that others begin to remember their own. This process also clears the karmic emotional contracts that Cancer has unconsciously upheld through lifetimes. The burdens they have carried, family trauma, ancestral guilt, emotional suppression passed down through blood, begin to unravel, not through force, but through forgiveness. Cancer becomes the sacred interrupter of cycles. They recognize that martyrdom is not nobility, and suffering is not proof of love. They release what was never theirs to carry, and in doing so, they open portals for generations forward and back. Their healing does not stop at the edge of their body. It echoes through their lineage, altering the course of history by rewriting the emotional story at its roots. As they continue to expand in self-love, Cancer develops an emotional magnetism that cannot be faked or manipulated. This is not attraction in the superficial sense, but a deep gravitational pull of authenticity. Souls recognize them before they speak. Their aura holds the frequency of remembrance. Those lost in the noise of disconnection begin to find themselves again through the quiet power of Cancer's presence. The world begins to respond not to what they do, but to who they are. And who they are, finally, is whole. In this radiant state, Cancer does not just live. They anchor light in the waters of humanity. They become both vessel and wave, memory and motion, stillness and surge. The moon, their celestial mother, pulses within them with renewed purpose. No longer merely ruled by lunar tides, they now rule with the moon. They walk hand in hand with divine timing, guardians of the sacred night, whisperers of dreams, protectors of what is real. And through it all, they remember. They were never broken. They were never too much. They were always the deep ocean the world forgot how to swim in. And now, loved by themselves, they rise, not as a version of who others needed them to be, but as the sovereign truth of who they have always been. Tidal, timeless, unstoppable. When Cancer learns to love themselves, there is a deeper metamorphosis that unfolds beyond emotional repair. One that reconfigures the architecture of their entire energetic being. The profound spiritual truth that often remains unspoken is that this act of self-love activates a return to the soul's original blueprint, the divine design that predates pain, rejection, and abandonment. Cancer does not merely heal. They return to essence. They become the living memory of who they were before the world taught them to fear their own depth. This return to source is not nostalgic. It is revolutionary. From an astrological standpoint, Cancer is the sacred guardian of origin. Not only the physical home, but the astral foundation of being. Cancer is the gate between the spirit and the womb, between the unseen and the incarnated. When they begin to love themselves, this gate is no longer flooded with sorrow, nor locked in self-forgetting. It becomes a radiant threshold through which the divine can descend into matter, and from which the soul can ascend into remembrance. Cancer becomes a pillar between worlds, a channel of sacred transmission. Their emotions, once dismissed as overwhelming, become holy currents of soul intelligence. This inner reclamation reawakens an ancient rhythm stored within their cellular memory. Cancer begins to move in alignment with the cosmic heartbeat, with lunar pulsations that echo in the tides and the blood. Their breath syncs with the waxing and waning of the moon. Their rest no longer feels like retreat but resurrection. Their silence is no longer emptiness but preparation for revelation. In this rhythm, they no longer chase timing, they become timing. They are not ahead nor behind. They simply are in eternal synchronicity with the divine. As their inner temple is restored, a vast field of energetic protection forms around them, not as a wall to isolate, but as a sovereign membrane through which only love and truth may pass. They become unshakable not by resisting life, but by embodying it. Their aura carries the scent of ocean storms and ancestral songs. They become both cradle and crucible, both sanctuary and fire. Their softness no longer invites exploitation, it demands reverence. Their compassion is no longer confused with compliance. It becomes a holy choice. What is often overlooked in Cancer's evolution is the resurrection of sacred rage. When they love themselves, they awaken the fire hidden beneath the waters. This is not the rage of destruction, but of divine boundary. It is the roar of the mother who no longer tolerates the desecration of the heart. It is the rising of the tide that washes away false stories, manipulations, and energetic debts. This rage, rooted in love and clarity, becomes a purifying force. It does not destroy, it liberates. Cancer becomes the storm that clears the air, the flood that breaks the dam, the truth that shakes the silence. Their creative force becomes undeniable. In loving themselves, they unblock the sacred wellspring of their imagination, intuition, and sensuality. They begin to create not as an escape, but as an extension of their being. Their art becomes prophecy. Their touch becomes medicine. Their presence becomes a spell. What they birth is not just beauty, it is transformation encoded in form. They become artists of the soul, weaving emotion into sacred structure, giving shape to feeling in a way that others can finally understand and inhabit. From the perspective of soul contracts, when Cancer loves themselves, they complete agreements they never consciously made. Agreements to carry others' emotional burdens, to bear ancestral wounds in silence, to be the emotional scaffolding for those unwilling to stand in their own healing. These contracts dissolve not in bitterness but in truth. The love they now give themselves burns through the invisible chains of karmic servitude. They are no longer bound by loyalty to suffering. They are loyal only to light. Their emotional mastery allows them to perceive dimensions hidden to others. They walk between worlds not as lost wanderers, but as initiated keepers of passage. They guide others not with advice, but with energetic presence. Their intuition becomes sharp as a blade and soft as velvet, penetrating illusion while preserving innocence. They become oracles, healers, storytellers, architects of emotional clarity. They do not ask to be believed. They embody truth so deeply that it echoes in every heart ready to receive it. There is also an untold grandeur in the way Cancer begins to influence collective evolution once they are fully seated in self-love. The entire water trine of the Zodiac, Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces, responds to this anchoring. As Cancer heals the root of emotional being, Scorpio is freed to transform without trauma, and Pisces is liberated to dream without delusion. Cancer's healing creates ripples across the psychic web of humanity, grounding sensitivity in strength, rooting empathy in discernment, and lifting vulnerability into sacred dignity. What emerges from this process is a soul that no longer negotiates with their own light. Cancer no longer seeks to be palatable. They are not afraid to be misunderstood. They know that their truth, their rhythm, their love is not for everyone, and it is no longer diluted to fit the unready. They are not here to be small. They are here to be eternal. They are not here to be needed. They are here to be sovereign. They are not here to be consumed. They are here to nourish the very fabric of existence. And so, when Cancer loves themselves, they do not simply survive the emotional gauntlets of life. They become the sacred architect of feeling itself. They become the embodiment of home not as a place, but as a frequency. They carry within them the ancient codes of soul nourishment, of lunar wisdom, of emotional resurrection. They are the salt of the sea and the stillness of the tide, the voice in the dream and the memory in the womb. They are the moon incarnate in human form, waxing, waning, wild, wise, and whole.